Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to this webinar. And thank you very much, Maria, for this, or Mary, for this introduction. I'm going to talk today about rent control, which is really one specific area we may deal with in the land economy tripos. And I will just guide you through that. And I'm also happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation then. But first, a little bit about me. So whom am I? So my name is Sofie Waltl. I am Austrian originally, but here in Cambridge, I'm an assistant professor in real estate economics and finance. So I'm part of the Department of Land Economy, and I'm also a member and the director of studies for land economy at Mary Edwards College. I'm a research economist in general, and I'm specialized in real estate that also includes housing markets and rental markets, but also wealth and inequality. And now I just want to start right away with this talk today with a very old theme, namely the Universal Declarations of Human Rights. So you probably remember in the aftermath of the Second World War, we, as all the states or many of the countries back then, agreed that we want to have some general rights every person as a human has. And all these rights also include certain living standards. Every human should have access to. What is a certain adequate living standard? So that means actually access to food, for instance, access to clothes, but also access to housing. So housing is actually one of the human rights. We've agreed every human being, just by being a human being, should have access to. So in that sense, housing is a very special product, so to say, from an economic point of view, but also a very special service that should be provided to all the people just because they are people. So this is something we also need to keep in mind when we think about housing market, that we are not talking about any good, a market good or so, but something very essential people just need to have just because they are human beings. So that's where we start. But then we also know that particularly now, many of you have probably heard of that in many places, there are currently really tight housing market, very often characterized by really high prices, both sales prices, so it's very hard to buy these days, but also rent prices tend to be quite high in many places, particularly in very popular cities. It is often difficult for people to find a place that is really nice for them and they can enjoy. So why is that? Why are prices, and particularly many people feel that they have become more expensive over the last year? Why is that? Usually when we look at it, we can actually conclude that prices are very often not the cause of a problem, but the consequence of a problem. And very often it would be said that there is too little supply of housing, so that all the demand that is there for housing cannot be met. Whenever we have such a scenario that there's little demand, that there's little supply and a lot of demand, the consequence is usually that prices are increasing. And that is actually true for both sales prices and for rent prices. And exactly this mechanisms is what we very often are seeing in particularly very attractive places, very attractive cities to live in. So why can it be actually that demand for housing is increasing, right? So we need to have little supply and a lot of demand. So how can it actually happen that suddenly maybe demand is increasing? The most obvious reason why demand is increasing is when population is growing. So when there are many people coming to a place, that also means that there will be more demand for housing because everyone needs a place to live somewhere. So that means growing cities usually have a problem with excess demand. There's also something we have seen over the last year, that people on average demand or wish to have more space per person. If we compare how people were living 100 years ago to how people want to live today, most people would want to have much more space than what was typical 100 years ago. So in that sense, by that also demand is increasing. Further, something good actually, there's a lot of income growth over the last years. That also means people can spend more. That also means very often the buy more housing. By more housing, I mean they buy more areas, so they're consuming more in that sense. Also, demand is increasing. And also what we had, particularly before the pandemic and then also in the aftermath of the pandemic, very, very low interest rates. So very low financial costs, financing costs. That also means cheap mortgages at the end. So many more people could actually afford mortgages. And by that, also demand was heavily increasing. So that is actually the increased demand. So what we need for prices to go up would mean that supply is not going up at the same way, right? So this is what we would need to see to, so that is usually what we would expect when we see increasing prices. So when you look at supply, for many economic goods, you would imagine that when demand goes up, supply would adjust and also go up. So that would be the usual mechanism. It's a bit different for housing, mainly because in the very short run, supply is pretty fixed. You cannot just today decide you want to have double as many houses as you had yesterday, because it takes a bit longer to actually construct them, to build them, to make them available. So there's usually a delay, so to say, and sometimes a pretty long delay in increasing supply just because of demand going up. So in that sense, what we usually say, we call that supply is fixed in the short run and can only adjust slowly over time. But then additionally, there are also some restrictions to supply in general that come on top. So supply is restricted by physical constraint as well as regulatory constraints. So by physical constraints, we mean, just imagine a city that is next to the coast. You cannot really build inside of the ocean anymore, right? So there's just an end, the city cannot grow further. Same is true when you have a mountain, when you have rivers, on things like that. So there are very often physical constraints. You cannot grow a city forever in that way. On the other hand, there are also regulatory constraints. So very often you're just not allowed to build the way you want to build. For instance, there may be zoning regulations. That means you are not allowed to build very high height constraints, or there may be so many additional things you need to consider when you buy new buildings. That means it also becomes very expensive to build new housing, so to say. So all these regulations, often very good, but also have the side effect that they very often limit actually the supply of housing. Yes. So these are actually regular constraints, but sometimes there's also not so much supply coming in, so to say, because it is not really profitable for private companies to also engage into that business, so to say. So companies, developers may not be willing to do so if it is not profitable. That is also something we currently see, that we have very high costs of building materials as well as very high labor costs. That means the building is currently incredibly expensive. And if you cannot then sell the product as the price it costs to build, most private developers would not engage in that. So this is another reason why supply very often, and particularly now, is not really meeting the demand that is coming from people who would like to actually find housing in a place. So all these are reasons why supply is very often not living up to the demand that is actually there. And again, remember, when we have this kind of mismatch, so a lot of demands, but not the supply to meet the demand, the consequence is usually that prices would go up. And that is true for sales prices as well as for rent prices. So that is a bit like the economic mechanisms we usually have in mind when talking about the problem of increasing prices. Right. So if there is such a market failure, so to say, should policymakers interfere, yes or no? That's a bit the question. Many people would actually say that housing is, when you now think back to the declarations of human rights, it's not just any product, but it's something very essential everyone needs. which is why many people, or if not even most people, would agree that it justifies that there should be intervention. And it is also the responsibility of policymakers to interfere to help that market to function a bit better. So in that sense, this is a bit like, okay, yes, please, we should do something. So it is something we should try to actually make work. But then the question is still, how should we do that, right? It's not that easy. And we are going to discuss about a couple of different tools that have been tried out in the past and also applied in different parts of the world and different cities. This is a bit like a policy toolkit I wrote down here. There are many different ones, and this is also not the complete list. There are probably more, but this is the main type, so to say. So one of them is rent control. No details now. We'll give it that for the rest of the talk. We're talking mainly about this policy. But then there are also other ones. So other ones would be social or public housing, right? That is when, for instance, local governments or also the general government, it really engaged in building housing for people who could not afford it, or for everyone, depending. Some countries would also do that in large scale, right? Another policy could be housing vouchers. That means some subsidies provided to people who do not earn enough to help them pay their rent mainly. Other ones would be to provide certain people with tax credits to make housing more affordable, particularly low-income people usually. Also inclusionary zoning, that means that is a planning policy that actually allows a mix of people in every place. Then there are mortgage subsidies. That also means that the financing costs are going down, also done by quite some countries. But then there are also governing equity loans, again, helping financing to buy property, and many more types of policies like that. What you see here is that some of them actually go for supporting renters, and some of them actually try to help people to buy a house, right? So two different approaches, both with the same goal that everyone has a house or a place to live. It doesn't have to be a house, can also be a flat, obviously, but a place to live. But it depends a bit on the tenure status the policies are targeting. Yeah, so that's a bit the question in general. As a policymaker, should we target tenants or owner occupiers? When we look at that a bit like globally again, both exist. So there are countries that really try to help that everyone can buy. And then there are countries that rather, or cities that rather go for supporting tenants to make renting more affordable. In general, there are probably, worldwide speaking, more policies targeting affordable renting market, but some exceptions are also there of countries that would really support owner-occupiers. There is one very famous example, that is Singapore. That is a country that is really mainly targeting supporting home ownership. Yeah, so that this is the primary goal, but also to a certain degree, quite famous is the US, that would also target to help people to buy, making mortgages more affordable. And for one way would be, for instance, that you can tax deduct your mortgage payments, your mortgage interest payments from your income tax, for instance. That means that the financing costs are going down massively. That also means that becoming an owner-occupier is easier when you have such policies in place. Right. But overall, one can say that supporting renters or making rental or like regulating rental market is a bit more common, particularly in Europe as a whole. But then still the question is a bit like, how do you wanna support renting? Gave you this list at the beginning already, but you can actually ask the question, or actually asking two questions to kind of start thinking of how you maybe want to regulate such a market. So the first big question, so to say, is, do you want to support buildings or do you want to support people? So supporting buildings means a bit so, okay, I'm providing social housing or I'm providing public housing, or some policies to lower prices for them. Or I just directly give to people that cannot afford properties on the free market by, say, housing vouchers or something like that, or so an income supplement. So that means I target the person directly, or I target to make rents in general a bit more affordable. So these are two different ways how you can tackle this problem. Yes, and then the other big question is, do you want to target the general rent level in a place, so the over price level, or do you want to only target those people who really cannot afford it? So that means for the poorest of the poor, so to say, you do something so that people would at least not land on the street. Or do you try to push down the entire price level that makes it a bit more affordable for everyone, but also for those who can actually afford it, right? So these are the two questions you need to have a bit in mind. From a cost perspective, sometimes you can say if you target an entire market, it's much more expensive than when only targeting a small subsegment. And on the other hand, when you target buildings, it also tends to be more expensive than when you target people, right? So that's a bit from a cost analysis, but the question is, yeah, that's a bit like how you can assess that. Yes, and I would like to now go a bit more into detail with one of these policies, and that is rent control. That is a policy of the first type. So this is actually supporting buildings, not people, but trying to make the entire, to make buildings more, less expensive. So actually reducing rents, not for people that really need it necessarily, but for all the buildings that are covered by a policy. Okay. So rent control, I also picked that one because it's very prominent and super old. So it has been actually done forever almost. The first evidence historians have found was in Rome. So when Caesar was actually capping rents for some Roman villas because the rents there were excessive. So we do find some evidence that that was already happening quite a while ago. But when you look at the modern times, this policy became very widespread during and also then in the aftermath of the First World War, and then again, Second World War. That was particularly in cities that were affected by partly destroyed housing stock. So that means that was actually reduced housing available, and by that rents were shooting up. So that's where rent control policies were put in place, but also in neighboring countries or areas, not in a war zone directly, but in neighboring areas where many refugees were actually coming. That meant that a lot of extra pressure was put on the rental market. Many people, like always, tried to kind of benefit from that and try to charge higher rents. So that was actually the scenario where the first rent control policies of the modern times were actually put in place. Also recently, as we've seen recently wars again, there was also when the attack of Russia to Ukraine started, that in the neighboring countries, particularly in Poland, rents were suddenly shooting up because many people tried to find a temporary home there. And that is also when such policies were put in place again. So it's kind of the same effect we've also seen a century ago. If you're more interested in that in the historical aspect, I quote here some, or actually two overview papers that give you a very long geographical and historic overview to this topic. But again, what is that really, rent control? So we usually distinguish two different types. I mean, to be honest, there are hundreds of different types, but you can roughly classify them into two different categories. One is the first generation rent control, and the second one is, well, second generation rent control. You can also say that first generation rent control was really tried out in the past and has been actually found to be a bit too tight for most occasions. What is today used most of the time is what they call second generation rent control. The difference is that for first generation rent control, that the initial rent amount in all new contracts is restricted by law. That means there may be an upper number of euros per square meters or pounds per square meters or pounds per room or something like that. So there would be a law text that would say what is the maximum you are allowed to charge. That is what they call first generation rent control. Second generation rent control, again, that's what is more common today, is when there is a cap on increases of existing rents over time. That means if you're living somewhere and you have a contract, then yes, rent may go up at some point, but there is a restriction or a limit to how much it is allowed to increase this rent. That is very often bound to some official indices. So for instance, inflation rates, consumer price index, or something like that. The idea of the second generation rent control is a bit that you stabilize the market so that there's not absolutely unexpected things happening to renters or tenants, so people can plan better and know what is going to happen, and it's not shooting up suddenly just because of landlord just want to do that, right? So in that sense, this is a stabilizing policy and also making renting more predictable, and in that sense also a bit more secure for tenants. Okay, so where do we have such kind of rent control first and second generation today? I mean, today roughly, so this map is from 2019. Second generation rent control, this is what I call kind of the modern way of doing things. In Europe, I have to add, in Europe and Canada, you see actually that this is very common. Not in Britain, not in the US, no, and also not in many other places. We still have first generation rent control, a bit in Africa and India, and some countries also in South America. And the rest of the world rather not controlled, or we don't have information about it. It could also be. So this is a bit of an overview. So when I'm saying that today it's more common to have second generation rent control, this is really a European perspective. Over time, when we look at it, how did that evolve? So this time scale here, timeline here starts at the beginning of the last century, and the two gray bars are the two world wars. And you actually see that these wars did trigger huge numbers of policies. So here the different lines, they show Germany, Europe, and the world. That is actually from the paper I'm going to present in a minute, and that is about Germany, which is why Germany is also highlighted here. But they actually move quite in parallel in general. You see it shoots up during and after the two wars. Then we have a time of actual deregulation, so to say. And in recent years, it went up again, mainly actually started by the pandemic first, when that went up again. Okay. So how do economists, so I'm an economist, right? So I would ask a question, how would economists think about rent control? Based on theoretical considerations, but also from a large, really large body of empirical studies that have been carried out to assess what are actually the consequences of this kind of policies. Yes, so in general, that it's a very prominent and old policy, yes, but economists today would argue that particularly the first generation of rent control, what we have seen is not that common in Europe anymore, but still in other places, is not a very smart thing to do. That this is actually creating very often more harm than good. What are the problems when you have such strict rent control policies in place? So there are a lot of studies. So I'm just quoting here some overview studies that actually built or actually derived a conclusion from a large body of literature. So some of the not so good consequences are that it discourages new constructions. So very often people are not really willing to invest into building more structures, something what you definitely would need to have to bring rents down. You need more supply usually, right? But rent control typically tends to decrease this construction. Also, it causes abandonment, which is also not necessarily good. Also, maintenance usually goes down, also not very good. It reduces mobility, so mobility of tenants. People are not really willing to move between places, maybe also not willing to move to smaller places when family sizes are shrinking, or also moving to another place when you maybe have a better job opportunity somewhere else. Simply with rent control, once you have secured yours, you don't want to leave anymore, because then you would lose your favorable terms. Yes. Then what else has been shown? So there is often a mismatch between housing unit and the tenants, also because of reduced mobility. That means that, for instance, I don't know, maybe a large family was living in a big apartment at some point, but at the end, many years later, there's only one person left, but still living in this very big apartment. Does that make sense? Usually not really, right? But again, there is an incentive to not change because you would lose your favorable terms. So that is often this mismatch we don't really like so much. But also there's some studies that have shown that there's more discrimination in housing, in rental housing, when you have rent control. Usually also creates black markets because people always try to circumvent policies that are too strict. And also, that is a really bad thing, encourages the conversation from rental units to owner-occupied units, which again means less units available to the rental markets. So these are some effects that have been shown that happen when you introduce strict rent control suddenly. And that is why many people would say that this is actually not the best of all possible policies to tackle the problem of not having enough rental units. Still, it is kind of quite common and quite prominent, particularly in exceptional times, like for instance, war times or also the pandemic, but much less often in normal times. And that's also a bit like how you can see that rent control can be a very good emergency policy you put in place for a short period of time during an emergency, but probably not something you would want to put in place in normal times to solving all your problems you have, your structural problems you have with the rental market. However, this is exactly what happened in Germany. So in 2020, when you think back, we did not know anything about Corona back then. That was really pre-pandemic. So that was actually a year where nothing really that spectacular happened. And no big catastrophe in that sense happened. But still, that was the year where Berlin, only the city Berlin, did introduce a very strict first generation rent control on top of everything they had in place. It was very shortly lived. I will tell you in a bit why. But by this policy, it was actually possible that we, as from a research perspective, were able to track in real time what happens when you suddenly put in place such a policy to a very developed rental market in this century, right? So this was, from a research perspective, a really nice experiment. Not so nice for people in Berlin, but very nice from a research perspective. And by that, we can also actually show the mechanism. Are they still as they were 100 years ago, or did anything really change? Okay, so what is the so-called Berlin experiment? Quite surprisingly for many, Berlin, so the city, Berlin, enacted a first-generation policy in 2020. It was called the Mietendeckel in German. It was not the only rental policy they had in place. It was actually on top of a lot of other rent regulations, including also an existing second generation rent control they already had in place. So they that's what they call the rent brake, Mietpreisbremse, that was already in place, and it just put a first generation rent freeze on top. I will show you actually what were the consequences, and there was a number of intended consequences, but also a number of adverse unintended side consequences that affected the Berlin market itself, but also many markets around, not just the city itself. It was also quite new, and that was also long-term the problem, that it was the first time since 1919 that a federal state in Germany did enact such rent regulations. And this is also because the German constitutions actually does not allow that. And that was actually the problem. So it was unconstitutional that a federal state or city does some kind of regulations in this domain, because in Germany, at least, this is the responsibility of the national regulator, but not on a federal level. This is also why the German Constitutional Court did revoke the policy in 2021 already. So just 1 year after it was enacted. So we have roughly 1 year where we could observe what would happen, but also when there's legal uncertainty about whether this is actually something that will stay or something that is here only temporarily. This just adds a little bit of extra flavor to this entire story. What was also interesting that when Berlin did that, a lot of media actually did write about it, actually everywhere. I also quote here, the mayor of London also wrote, okay, if Berlin can freeze rents for 5 years, there's no reason why London shouldn't be able to freeze rents for at least 2 years in these extraordinary times. That was a quote. It was never enacted, probably also because he saw what happened to Berlin, what was not so good. But statements like that were quite common. And there was also a lot of international media echoes everywhere in the world. They were all talking about this Berlin experience because it was quite exceptional. Okay, so how can we, as researchers, actually assess such a policy? How would you do that? So first, what you do is, because there are many things, right? So if legal insecurity, you have then like the majority of the properties in the market would be affected by this policy, but not all exactly. And only properties within Berlin would be covered, but not across the official city boundaries. But just like most cities, Berlin is larger than the official administrative boundaries, right? So we have actually this gap here. So lots of effects. So that's what they actually did, is that we first wrote a theoretical model, that's a mathematical model, to first model what should happen to prices, what should happen to the number of advertisements that are put out after introduction of this policy, and so on, and all that under legal insecurity, as well as is there some hedging that could be done. I do leave out that part. If you're interested, you can definitely read the study, but I think I can also show you that by just showing you the empirical analysis, which is a bit easier to grasp. But that really helps us to organize all the thoughts in the head. Otherwise, it's getting very complex. So after setting up this model, we can also look at data that was produced by the market in real time. So what we actually can look at are rent advertisements that are published online, and look at how offered prices are actually changing over time, and use that for building some empirical models and empirical tests to test the prediction from this model. We can do so by applying what we call causal inference techniques that helps us to be sure what is affecting what, that we are not mixing up correlations or things that are happening at the same time or in the same way, but really that we can say, okay, this policy is causing this outcome, and this is the reason why this is happening. We can do that by this kind of empirical techniques. So what we try to measure are overall price effects within Berlin over different periods of time. So pre-announcement, then between announcement and enactment, and then after enactment. So the different periods within Berlin, and then also a spatial discontinuity along the city border of Berlin, what happens just across there, what happens to smaller towns and villages across the border, are they affected and in which way? So these are all the price effect, how we call it, but then also what happens to quantities. So are actually more or less advertisements published, and are they changing in any other way? That's what you call either quantity effects or volume effects. Okay, so to do so, we need to understand how the policy was really set up so that we can identify which properties were affected and which properties were not affected. So in general, the policy was really only targeting the administrative city of Berlin. Again, not the outskirts of Berlin, because they are not anymore officially part of Berlin. Initially, the policy was planned to be valid for 5 years upon enactment. That was the 23rd of February 2020. It was eventually valid but shorter because the court has abolished it earlier. Per default, the policy did actually say that all residential premises were covered, but then afterwards names a couple of exceptions, which properties would be exempt from this policy. And then it would also state what would be the maximum amount of rent that is allowed to be charged for each type of property. So it was really written there in euro terms, what is the maximum rent per feature a property would provide. So in general, it was rent excluding running costs that were targeted, and they were ex post frozen at the level that was observed in 2019, right? So there is a register, and you can actually look up how was it roughly back then, and then you go back there, look how much was the rent, and then this is how it was kept. And then there's also what is called a valid rent that really depends on the features of these properties. So that is the maximum price that was allowed to be charged in general. How to compute a valid land rent? Not that easy, actually. Depends a bit on the year of construction and the basic equipment that was provided. So really basic. So is there heating? Is there a bathroom? And things like that. When you put it all together, you can actually show that the range that was allowed was between roughly 4 euros per square meter and roughly 10 euros per square meter, which is nothing, right? Particularly when you compare it to now. But these were the caps that were in general imposed, that range. So this is the basic valid rent, and then you can add some additional euros per square meter if there are any special features that are provided. So depending on location within Berlin, you can add some location add-ons. Then also you can adjust, or some add-ons are permitted if you have modern equipment that is provided by this apartment. For instance, if there's an elevator or whatever. And again, location I've told you already. And that is really defined on an address level. Quite interesting how much they went actually into detail. Originally, it was also foreseen that they would be allowed to inflation adjust prices capped by a maximum of 1.3%. Sounds like nothing today after this experience we had, but back then there was almost no inflation, so it was actually not really relevant back then. Yes, and that was actually the plan. Okay. But then there were a couple of units that were exempt. So first, all the newer buildings, so everything, all the units that became available for occupation for the very first time on January 1st, 2014 or after were per se exempt. So all the newer ones were not covered by this policy. Also apartments that have been substantially modernized after a prolonged period of non-occupation were also exempt. Then also publicly subsidized apartments were also exempt, and housing units just outside the administrative boundaries of Berlin were also not covered because the policy only targeted really Berlin. And we use these exceptions, except the public subsidy response, because they're very different, to test how did prices in this group of accepted properties and the group of covered buildings, how did they change over time of this, from pre-announcement up to abolishment of this policy, what happened to them? So we were looking at rent advertisements on pretty much all online portals that are used in Germany. So they're all pulled together. And this is very timely because when you look at the advertising behavior of landlords, you really see what they are thinking in real time. So we really can observe the landlord's behavior by that. So we were actually cooperating with a private company that actually did mainly collect all this data and pooling all the different portals together so that we have a kind of full view of the market. So what we observe are rental advertisement. That means what is the price they offer or they ask for, plus where is that apartment and what are the features of this apartment. So all the normal things you would usually see in rental advertisements, we were able to observe. Also the geolocation, so we know exactly the address or longitudes, latitudes of the properties. By that we can definitely judge which apartment is covered by the policy and which apartment is not covered by the policy. And additionally, we could also search in the so-called free text field some extra information, and that was actually when we tried to find whether there are some nice hedging strategies applies because of rent freeze. Okay, so what do we find? So we use this data to build first a general trend in price levels, so to say a house price index based on this data. So when you look at this graph, you see a rent index, or actually two rent indexes. That's the dashed line's rent index. And you actually see that upon announcement to enactment, rent prices started to slowly decrease in comparison to before, where they were increasing, but not too much, but still rather increasing. Then they started to decrease, and upon enactment, they really dropped. That's the first consequence, then going up again, but then down again, right? When you look at sales prices in comparisons, we don't really see anything like that. So prices were shooting up and then stayed at a rather high level, did not go further up, but rather stayed there. They were not falling. Also, they were not restricted. The rent prices were restricted, so this is not surprising. That's all the properties pulled together, not distinguishing between properties that were covered and those that were not covered. Right. But then what we can actually do, we can estimate models where we can really distinguish between that what we call treatment group, so properties that were treated, were covered by the policy, and those that were not covered. Looking at the entire time horizon, looking at the announcement of the policy, then the transition period where it was announced but not yet enacted, and then what happened after enactment. And then we actually stopped the analysis pretty soon after, because then something else happened. You remember, COVID kicked in. That also created a big mess to the market. So we tried to not confound the two things. So we just cut off the analysis then. Okay, so this is, sorry, a regression table. So these are usually the outcomes of the statistical models we are estimating on this kind of data. We do so because when you try to compare rent prices depend on so many things, including like location and everything they provide. So we need to control for all these features to then filter out what is really the price effect we cannot explain because of the characteristic, but only because of the policy, right? So this is what we try to do here. And you don't need to understand all the numbers here, but what is important is that you look at this last line of this table here. That means treatments times post-enactment. That is really, did prices in the group of properties that were covered by the policy after the enactment of the policy, did they go down, yes or no? And the answer is yes, they did. That's all in log terms. So you need to take the exponent actually for that to get the full effect. But that actually means that it went down by up to 11% or so upon enactment. Given the figure I've shown you before, this is not surprising, but we can actually show it was really driven only or almost only by the properties that were covered by the rent freeze. But this is not surprising because that was the goal of the policy. So yes, the policy did achieve that. Prices were really going down. Okay. Yes. But again, now we were also looking at what other effects it did cause, if not, because the first effect is actually nice because that's what we want to see. We want to go that prices are going down. That's good. But let's see what else is happening. Remember, the policy was only valid within the city, right? But not across the administrative borders. So what we try to do is that we use what we call a spatial regression discontinuity model to check whether there is, upon enactment, suddenly a price gap that was not there before across the border. So on the left-hand side of the border and the right-hand side of the border, are prices developing in a different way once the policy was enacted? So that's a bit the question. Graphically, we actually classified all the advertisements we saw in either, okay, you are part of Berlin or you are outside of Berlin, and then try to measure whether they behave in a different way. Again, we looked at it by going bit closer to the border or a bit further away on both sides of the border, right? And try to measure whether there is, upon enactment, suddenly an enlarged price grab. And that you would see by, again, the last line of this table, what we call post-E, so post-enactment Brandenburg. So Brandenburg is the federal state around Berlin. And that means how do prices change outside of Berlin, just across the border, after the policy was enacted. And what you see here is that there were always positive effects. That means prices were going up actually quite substantially, here by 14 to 15%, just after the introduction of this policy. That means that yes, in Berlin they were going down, but on the other side of the border, they were really going up, which is not nice and not really the effect they actually wanted to have. We can also explicitly look not just along the border, but at smaller villages and Potsdam, which is a smaller city across the border. How did prices change there? And this is also what we find there. The prices were in all these cities really going up. When we compare Berlin to other larger cities in Germany, Berlin was really a bit of an outlier. So prices were going down in Berlin, while in pretty much all other cities in the same period of time, prices were going up. So kind of the trend was just reversed in Berlin as comparison to other ones. Okay, so these are the price effects. So again, it was not really intended that in other places prices would go up, but it's not really surprising in some way, right? But then we look at like what happens to the number of advertisements that are posted. So economic theory would usually tell us that when you restrict prices, then more and more people are not willing to rent out properties anymore. That would be a theoretical prediction, but we can test and check whether this is actually the case. Yeah. So yeah. So we can actually, just kind of count the number of apartments that are still advertised for. We do so in different ways. So what we can actually show is that there are quantity effects in 3 different ways. So first, there are statistics compiled about the use of new dwellings. So these are the number of units that are converted from rental use to owner-occupied use over time. That's a yearly statistics provided for each federal state. And we can actually show or actually see in the data that the number of conversions in that year of the rent freeze was as high as it had never been before. So many people just decided, okay, my rental property is not going to stay a rental property, but we will now use it for own occupation, either by ourselves or selling it to someone else. That means that the rental market was shrinking massively because of the policy, something that is not good for the rental market in general. You want to have sufficient properties there. Next, new construction, also a measure of how many units are actually available to the market. And that is also something that is collected by official statistics. And we can see that in 2020, the number of completed new dwellings declined sharply, namely by 14% roughly, as compared to the year before. While in rest of Germany, that was not the case. So this was really, again, only in Berlin the case. Again, this is not a good sign because that means, again, even fewer properties available to the people, which is not good. And then a third way of looking at this also that we look at how many, by counting the number of property advertisements that were posted in these online portals. And also by that measure, we can show that there were really, really much lower numbers. That is also what I show here graphically. That's actually the left panel of the two. That is how many apartments were roughly advertised there before the policy was announced. That's the pre-period. Then before the policy was enacted, the transitory period, and then the post-period after it was enacted. And then we see that, okay, that's really massively less. Not so much for sales advertisements, not really, but the rental ones were really dropping. So these are very bad effects already, so to say, all expected. But what is actually happening with this legal insecurity? Because probably people are also reacting to that, right? Remember that the policy was in place only for roughly a year, because at the end, the Constitutional Court did revoke it. But of course, this was not totally surprising. Many people thought already that this may happen. So there was insecurity. People knew that it may just not hold, right? Maybe not everyone, but probably many did. And it was also big in the news area. So is that actually legal? Can you do that? Right? So we have this very interesting setting that no one really knew what will happen and how long this policy will actually be there in place. So we have legal insecurity. What we actually can also see in the market is a not very nice reaction, you can say, namely that many landlords that were offering apartments to rent, which were fewer ones, as we have already seen, but those who still offered, they put an extra clause on top. And that extra clause was mentioned there in this free text field. We scraped them. That would state, okay, so the rent price according to the policy is this amount of euros, but should it be not legal, then you will need to pay back everything. And the true price is the other one, the alternative price, right? So we can actually observe that. So we can also assess whether people did also make use of this kind of what you can call a hedging strategy. Again, very dangerous for tenants, because potentially that means like huge financial risk. But again, from a landlord perspective, kind of makes sense to do it, right? Okay, so we can observe and check, did they actually do it? Did they follow this so-called hedging strategy? So what we see here is, so we split the sample of rent advertisements into a group. So those that are subject to the rent freeze, that is the top panel, and the bottom panel, those are the units that are not subject to it because they're newer ones, right? Remember that the very new ones were exempt from the policy. So when you look at the newer ones, there's not really changing. So there's a seasonal effect, but we also have seasonality in posted advertisements. That's pretty normal. Otherwise, there's no radical change in suddenly. However, when you look at the top panel, things look a bit different. So what we see is that the number of ads is going down massively, right? And we split that into two groups, namely those advertisements that did state this double rents, so kind of using this hedge, and those not using this hedge. And what we see is that most of the advertisements actually use the hedge. That means that it was really dangerous, so to say, for everyone signing a contract in these times because it meant that potentially they had to pay back large amounts of money ex post, right? And lenders were apparently very well aware of that and also made use of that. Okay. Right. So this quantity effect, in many ways, are not really surprising. This has also been seen in other markets already. So again, we are actually adding new evidence to a larger body of literature, all studying similar policies worldwide. And this drop in the number of units that are available, measured again, as said before, in many different ways, is one of the really bad features and probably the one reason why many people would actually not recommend to use such policies, because overall, making the problem even more problematic, so to say. You can say that, again, the high price of rent is the consequence of low supply already. By introducing such a policy, supply usually drops even further. That means making the market even tighter and even harder for people that want to live there, right? That is much less of a problem for people that have been living in a place for a longer period of time, but it's really problematic for new people, new tenants that are newcomers of any kind, but most of all, younger people that come to the rental market for the first time. So for them, it's actually the hardest. And that is the adverse effects of such a policy, of the first generation policy, which is why many economists would actually say, maybe not so good. Maybe try to use a different policy, maybe more sustainable and more longer lasting. Yeah, that's a bit like part of the conclusion, which I summarize here. I've actually shown you different types of consequences of such a policy. And this is a type of thing we actually do a lot. So we look at legislation and then try to assess what are the intended effects and what are the real effects by just looking at the evidence that is provided by people's actions. And then by that, we can actually conclude, is it a good idea or is it maybe not a very good idea? In that case, I think it's pretty clear actually that having such a first generation rent control is probably not a very good policy tool. And then maybe going for one of the other options that are there is probably a bit wiser and more sustainable, so to say. I don't want to reiterate because I think I hope you remember what are roughly the consequences, but try to focus a bit on the general conclusion that this very strict capping of rents is not helping to solve the problem, but probably making it even harder. Policies that are targeted to boost supply, so to say, to create more housing, that are much more expensive usually in that sense and much more difficult to do, but they are the more sustainable way forward, but not really capping rents of existing buildings. So that is a bit the conclusion. And again, this is like in line with what other researchers have found in many places globally, that this is not really new. Most economists would also say not really surprising because the mechanisms are just triggered like that and people tend to behave like that. That's why probably trying to go for more inclusive and targeted policies that tackle the source of the problem, and that is too low supply, is probably the better way forward. And that is also the conclusion of this paper. And that's also a bit of how we do empirical research in housing markets in general, but in general, all economic policies. So we look at intended effects, and then we look at the mechanism, look at the data, look at the behavior of people, and try to understand, is that a good way forward or maybe not so? Should you find it interesting, you can also read the paper, and you can also go for the math, which is also interesting if you like math, and can also try to find your own conclusions about this topic. Otherwise, I'm done with my talk. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to hear any of your questions. Yeah, good question. I mean, very concrete policy recommendation is always a bit difficult because, again, so intuitively, I would say that's probably a good idea because it means that you lower demand, right? By saying that you make it unattractive, that people go for a second or third or fourth home and so on, means automatically lowering demand, which is one way of taking out pressure of housing markets. Whether this is enough is questionable, but probably is definitely better than setting price caps because it really tackles the problem that there's too much demand and too low supply, so to say, by trying to decrease the demand. The best way forward is probably to try to boost supply, right? But also trying to limit demand a bit, yes, but probably not going to solve the problem, or at least not the entirety of the problem. Yeah, I think these three subjects are perfect preparation for land economy, right? So it's actually the perfect mix. So you need to have quantitative skills. So math is also a good idea. Any other preparation probably also helpful, yeah. Well, in terms of, so here we were using hedonic models. That means we were not looking at trying to explain the entire supply, so to say, but trying to explain the variety of prices within the city. And that is the concept here is hedonics. That means that we do acknowledge that there's a large of price differences because of different characteristics of properties. So each house is a bit different. That's why each house also achieves different prices and different rents on the market. And that is what hedonic models would actually do. That is also probably one of the most standard model classes you will always see when you study land economy, because everything that relates to housing would use hedonic price models as kind of a basis. Yes, the thing is also we still need a home for everyone at the end. So probably using that for residential housing is not the worst of all ideas. The question is always how you do it, right? So you try to have denser cities, for instance. That means usually environmentally a bit like more friendly because people are not driving for ages to go to the place where they work, for instance. So you are close by, you can walk or maybe take a bike or whatever. So that would also be a way to build in a way that is more environmentally friendly because you decrease the commuting time people spend on the road and things like that. But obviously, it's absolutely true that there's a trade-off between the two. If you think back, one of the first slides I had in this presentation was actually a long list of policies that have been trade out. When you go through the list, you see some are actually tackling supply and some are tackling prices. Actually, only one is really tackling prices, and that was the rent control. The other one is really to making like either incentivizing supply in general, by that automatically prices would go down, or to help people to afford it. So particularly people that are not able to, so to say, survive on the free market, particularly those need to have some help. And the question is like how exactly to do it, but housing vouchers, for instance, would be one reason or one solution, or providing public housing, things like that would be something that is less harmful. So that is a bit like when you remember the two ways of policy making here is targeting people. So whoever needs support would get it, or targeting houses, meaning all the houses are covered, right? And probably policies that go target people makes more sense than policies that target houses per se. Many things. That's probably the nature of the subject because land economy, as everyone interested in land economy probably knows, is that it is a multidisciplinary subject. So you have combination of law, economics, also environmental subjects, and things like that. So that means that people are no experts in all this particular subject, but they have a very broad overview and are interdisciplinary by themselves. On the other hand, you are taught by people that are specialized in one or the other area. So I am an economist specialized in economics or finance and something like that, but we also have people specialized in other areas, and you would actually benefit from this variety of having this overview and the interdisciplinary approach. And then you can do many things from that. You can go to policy, you can go to the private sector too, right? You can also go and do a PhD afterwards or a master or whatever. So there are many opportunities in that sense, and difficult to describe what is the typical path actually, simply because it's very distinct what the opportunities are. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I also don't really understand that, because for me, it's pretty obviously that this is not the way forward. If rent control, then yes, second generation is a good idea, but first generation is not a good idea. And we have now collected a lot of evidence that is not working. I mean, one explanation why it's still kind of attractive to policymakers could be that it is incredibly cheap for policymakers to do, because they only have to enact such a policy, not that hard. But you don't really have to organize building new housing, right? That's a bit harder. So it's a very cheap policy, so to say, easy policy, but not very effective, right? Organizing, I don't know, to build like public housing, for instance, takes more effort in that sense. So maybe seems like a easy, fast fix, but very often, like with easy and fast fixes, not necessarily the best idea to do so. Yeah, definitely. Second generation, what is usually the good thing about that is that it helps people to plan, because there is kind of, so the idea is you have a stabilizing factor. So you know that prices may go up, but you know how and when and by which measure. Usually prices are bound to something like a CPI, so inflation rates, and wages are usually also bound to that. So that means that overall you can really, people really know what to expect in that sense and can also plan their future, which makes renting actually a very attractive alternative to owning, because you can have the stability in the same way as you can have in owner-occupied housing. Yeah, well, that's very specific to this country. It's also a good idea to try to meet demand, right? So if there are many people searching for housing, any idea to increasing the housing is a good one. The question is always, is it in the right place, right? Because that also matters. It doesn't help to just have houses anywhere, but it should be there where the jobs are, right? So that is actually the goal. So in general, yeah, well, you can assess by yourself. Well, I think particularly in the first year, what some people are struggling with is when they are not prepared in terms of math and statistics. So as you have actually seen, like a lot of our research is actually very empirical. That also means you need to have very profound statistical skills. And this is also how the course starts, with a lot of math and then also economics. So the basic courses in economics and econometrics would actually mean that there's a lot of quant. And for some people, it's maybe easy if they go through the maths things again, so to say, and do a bit more statistics. That's probably quite helpful. Otherwise, reading whatever you can, even like popular novels or whatever, it's always good when you read about policies and experiences and such kind of experiments. There's a lot of popular reading out there, and it's probably a very good preparation. Well, they didn't. It's actually a pretty unaffordable city, particularly compared to 20 years ago, where Berlin was a quite affordable city. Not anymore. So actually, this policy really created extra harm and did not necessarily go solve in a very good way. Well, maybe. I mean, it was definitely very popular among people when it was first advertised or announced, because it sounds really attractive. And I mean, also the quote I showed you from the Mayor of London was like, hey, we can also do that. That's easy, because it is easy, right? You just write down the policy. That's it. You don't have to do more. But it doesn't tackle the source. That means it's probably not very sustainable long term. And that is also a bit like what we try to teach you, is to really try to find out what is a cause and what is a consequence. And here we can actually say the high prices are a consequence, but you need to tackle the cause, and that is too low supply. Obviously, for a politician, it is probably something quite easy to sell, to tackle directly the price, but it's probably not a very sustainable and long-lasting policy. That's why we would probably argue against that. And that is also the way how to approach, how to assess it in a kind of neutral way by looking at it and then assessing the outcomes and then assess overall, was it good? Or overall, are maybe other policies better? And I think here we can say, yeah, other policies probably are better. Good. Yes, and I was told that we are running out of time. So anyhow, it is super nice to talk to you, and thank you very much for all these interesting questions. I'm very happy that you're all interested in housing markets. It is a fascinating topic, so I fully agree with you. And yeah, maybe see you around in Cambridge.